Hannah, very nice to see you again. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well, very well. I was very excited to speak with you, as you know. Just for some context and background, I came across you on Twitter very randomly, off like a retweet or something. You immediately caught my attention because what you're talking about is something that has been on my mind for quite some time with just the schooling system in general. I have two young kids, one on the way, my oldest starting kindergarten. It's in September. I've had questions, and this stuff has been on my mind for quite a while about the traditional school system and if it's the best place for my kids. And I know a lot of parents in my network and uh, people, family, and things who definitely have similar questions. I know for a fact, and I know they'll find this helpful and valuable. Here we are. Thank you so much for connecting.
Yeah, I was so excited when you reached out. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm excited to see where the next hour and change takes us.
Me too. Me too. So tell us about yourself, in your background and what you're all about right now.
Yeah, so I ended up in alternative education entirely by accident. I went to a Montessori inspired preschool and kindergarten, and then I grew up homeschooled first through 12th grade. So to me, all of this weird educational stuff that I talk about was just my normal day to day life. And after I graduated from high school, I decided to skip college and I went and worked for an alternative uh, higher education program called Praxis, that is basically a startup apprenticeship program for young people who want to go work in business but don't want to spend 4 years in business school. They land apprenticeships at high growth startups and gain the portfolio experience they need to have a business career that way. Um, and that experience really solidified for me a lot of this alternative education stuff from just personal experience to much broader theory and practice. Um, and by the time I left Praxis, I was sort of resigned to the fact that I was going to be working in alternative education for the foreseeable future because I just care a lot about it. And I know a lot about it because it's been 20 plus years now that I've been immersed in it. And I feel really strongly that I got incredibly lucky to have such a great education experience. And I know that part of the reason that I was able to have such a great experience is because my parents found people who had taken alternative paths and had talked about their experiences and where they'd ended up after taking those paths. And it kind of gave my parents the reassurance that not sending me to traditional school was going to be an okay thing to do and I'd probably turn out all right. And so I feel really strongly like I want to talk about this stuff too, because there are a lot of
Yeah.
kids out there who are really smothered by the traditional education system, and that makes me very sad. And I want as many of those kids as possible to be able to have a really vibrant and thriving childhood that sets them up for life success without feeling beholden to the traditional paths and the traditional, well, you're just supposed to do this because some bureaucrat once upon a time said that everybody should. So I feel really strongly like this is something that I want to talk about a lot because I want to help those kids.
I love it. Yeah, it's such an important time, and it's so relevant right now. And
Yeah.
I think the spotlight is on alternative schooling now more than ever before. And I think part of that is probably like COVID, and it kind of accelerated and brought these questions in people's heads during the last 2.5 years. In that sense, I think it's a great thing. You were homeschooled your entire life,
Yeah.
basically, right? From kindergarten to grade 12,
First through 12th.
first through 12. Okay. How was that experience? Like how would you describe this? I know this could be a very lengthy answer, but in a concise way, like how was that experience?
It was one of the best things that ever happened to me. I had such an incredibly idyllic childhood, and I didn't really realize how unique that was until I became an adult. Um, my elementary education was very um, almost whimsical, actually. it was very inspired by Waldorf schools, which are a very kind of whimsical sort of education that's very focused on nature and art and like very hands-on activities. And so when I was in elementary school, like we did all the standard, we learned grammar and we learned math, but the majority of my education was we'd go for nature walks and we'd learn how to identify all of the different wildflowers, and then it would rain and all the mushrooms would pop up and we'd learn how to identify all the different types of mushrooms, and we'd like draw botany books, and we would do lots of art, and we'd learn about different branches of mythology, and we'd illustrate the myths that we were learning about. And it was just a very beautiful education, and it's
Mhm.
also far more efficient than being in traditional classrooms for 7 hours a day. So we do school in a couple hours a day, and then the rest of the time I was free to play and explore and run around outside and build projects. And I did lots of very self-directed activities because of all of the space and the freedom that I had. I had one sister. She's 6 years younger than I am, and she was uh, my 24/7 playmate, and we got into all kinds of trouble and adventures together. So that was elementary school. And then we got a lot more academic in middle school and high school, and I was a really academic kid, and at the time we didn't know if I was going to be college bound or not, but we hadn't spent a lot of time researching alternatives to college, so we kind of assumed I would be. So we spent a lot of time doing like making sure that all the boxes were checked, that if I decided to take the college route I'd have everything that I needed. So I did like all the standard science and math and English credits or whatever you want to call them that I'm supposed to get, but there was still a lot of room for customization. And we used a lot of online resources when I was in middle school and high school, so a lot of video programs, a lot of resources online. We did for high school, I used the Teaching Company or the Great Courses, which is basically just recorded college lecture series by basically the best professors in the country on whatever area they're recording a lecture series on. It's like the best expert on Greek history and the best expert on um, I don't know, classical literature. And it's recorded and designed for continued ed for adults who are curious about this stuff. But it was great for me in high school too. So I did all the kind of the standard stuff you were supposed to do, but then I was such a nerd and I wanted to add as many classes as I possibly could. So I did like a deep dive into um, like I did medieval literature one year and read a bunch of medieval literature and listened to a bunch of lectures on it. And I did an oceanography course and I did an anatomy course, and I found videos of cadaver dissections for like medical school students, and I watched those and thought it
Oh,
was just like incredibly fascinating. For my senior year of high school, I thought it'd be really cool to read the great books or like the Western canon for English. So I listened to a lecture series on that and read as many of the great books as I could. So I had this very eclectic education that
interesting.
kind of was following the trajectory of what you're supposed to do in high school, but also was like very much picking up things that I didn't realize at the time, but I realized afterwards is actually like what you do in college. And it was really tailored around my interests because I could choose whatever I wanted to study. And my parents basically gave me the reins in high school. And like I chose what I was going to study. I found all the resources that I was going to use. I gave myself assignments. I gave myself deadlines. I'm the one who made sure it was all getting done by the end of the year. I gave myself my own grades. Like it was all me. My parents were just
Wow.
there to make sure that I was meeting the state requirements and had everything I needed. But that was a really cool
Right.
experience too because it taught me a lot of self-ownership, which is a really important life skill that most kids don't get at all in
Yeah,
traditional school.
that all sounds just so like incredible, but at the same time, just so different than what everyone is used to.
Yeah.
Um, so just describe the logistics of like homeschooling. Like, what is it actually like? Is it your parents like more involved with you? Is it just all online? Like, what's the actual like setup of
It
being homeschooled?
really depends. There's a lot of different ways that you can homeschool your kids. Um, So the experience that I had is not necessarily even the norm among homeschoolers, or like consistent among most homeschoolers, because everybody's creating this tailored experience for their kid and their individual needs. So for me, in elementary school, it was like when we'd quote unquote do school, it would mean that my mom and my sister and I would get together like in the living room or at the table, or sometimes we just sit on the stairs or like wherever we wanted to hang out. And she'd read to us, or she'd kind of like explain what we were doing, and then she'd either give us worksheets. We used curriculum sometimes for like grammar and math, and so she'd like give us the next lesson, or we'd be reading a book about mythology or the history of Europe, and she'd read us a chapter or whatever. And it was just sort of like we'd hang out for a couple hours and we'd do whatever the lesson or the project or the exploration for the day was. And then we also did we were part of homeschool co-ops, homeschool groups, which ours was not called this at the time, but it was kind of similar. It was like a cross between science classes and a forest school, which I don't know if you're familiar with forest schools at all, but it's worth
Is it like a
Googling.
Waldorf school?
Say what?
Is it like a Waldorf?
No, it's for homeschoolers or people who aren't. It's not, because usually it's 1 day a week, and there's like guides that you can use on how to structure your forest school. But a lot of people, they go to parks every week and they
Mm.
do outside activities, and it's for younger kids, especially like elementary age. um and what we did was kind of similar to that, where we took classes at our county park with the naturalists, and it was much more academic and science based than what they do in a forest school. But we'd also go for hikes in the woods every week with our homeschool group,
Mm.
and we'd learn how to track different kinds of animals and how to identify different types of wild edibles and how to build fires and build shelters and all kinds of survival skills. It was really cool.
Yeah.
And our co-op would also pool resources to hire a drama teacher or hire a Spanish teacher, and do some of these types of classes that's a little bit harder to do at home on your own.
Hmm.
So we do that 1 day a week. But besides that, it was pretty much all home based. And
Yeah.
then
Interesting.
in middle school and high school, it was a lot more. We found online resources that
Hmm.
we used for most of the classes because they were more advanced. And in high school, it was pretty much all these lecture series from the teaching company and then another company called Modern Scholar. And then I took a couple MOOCs through Coursera, massive open online courses for those who aren't familiar. Tried a couple of those through Coursera. Um, we did some supplementation through Khan Academy and other sites like that. So it was kind of a mixture. We'd choose the subjects that we wanted to be studying, and then we'd go find the resources that we needed. But
Hmm.
for me in middle school and especially high school, it was mostly me sitting at the computer until my schoolwork was done for the day, watching
Yeah.
lectures and writing essays and doing problems and taking notes and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Very academic.
So from what I'm hearing, like even like your homeschooling experience was like is not linear at all. Like it just goes into many different directions, and you know, like is that accurate? Like it just kind of is there like describe like the structure? Is there any structure in it?
Yeah, we did. It actually was pretty structured because we were following fairly closely the yearly standards that you were supposed to meet to be on like the average academic trajectory, especially
Okay.
because again, we thought I was college bound for a really long time because I loved learning. In another life, I probably would be a PhD student right now because I was
Hmm.
that academic. and I was that interested in learning. And there was a version of me that would have been very happy in academia forever.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it felt pretty linear because we'd be looking at the state standards and saying, okay, what are you supposed to be learning this year? What boxes are you supposed to be checking? Especially in high school, we made sure that I was doing 4 years of English, and each year, like the things that counted as English were kind of broad. One year I did a whole lecture series on how to construct great sentences, and we studied like Faulkner and Joyce and all of these authors who write really beautiful and very over the top in retrospect
Yeah.
sentences, and I learned how to write like that, and that was English for a year. So it was kind of a lot more dynamic than what you would get in traditional school, but there was a linear progression to it where we
Yeah.
were making sure that I was sort of on the track that I needed to be if I wanted to
That
step
makes
onto the
sense.
traditional system at any point.
Makes sense. So it's kind of like a, I don't know if it's like a devil's advocate question, but something you said that's interesting. So um, you were doing things that you were supposed to be doing, like
Mm-hmm.
based on the traditional system. Like, is that a little like contradictory to homeschooling in a way, or do there's still like a parallel? They go hand in hand somehow.
So that's a really great question. And my answer kind of varies based on context because it really comes down to the kids' goals. I think I say that we were doing what we were supposed to be doing kind of loosely. We were making sure that I had a year of chemistry if I decided that I wanted to go to college, but it wasn't like we were making sure that I was following everything in the school curriculum and I wasn't doing it the way that they did it in school. Like my dad taught me how to do titrations on the back of like on the tailgate of his pickup truck and stuff like that. We were
Yeah.
doing like it was much more organic than what you
Hmm.
do in school. And it was all self driven, which is the most important piece. I was the one who was saying, no, I think I might want to go to college. I want to make sure that I can get in. And then my mom said, well, you have to make sure, if that's the case, you have to make sure that you have these specific
Yeah.
boxes checked because that's what an admissions department requires. But
Yeah.
I was the one who wanted it. And that's really
Makes
important.
sense.
Um,
Yeah.
because that's one of the distinctions between a true, I even hesitate to say homeschooling, like a true unschooling experience. I think a lot of people think that homeschooling is just bringing the classroom home, and that's not what
Yeah.
it's supposed to be at all. If you're just replicating school at home, you're doing it wrong, in my opinion. And I
Yeah.
feel that very strongly. Um, but a true at home self-directed education experience, the kids at the forefront, and it's what the kid wants, is like that's the most important thing. They should be driving the experience. So for me, I was veering pretty closely towards making sure that all the rough standards on paper were being met because I wanted to make sure again that I could do the things that I thought I wanted to do. But
Hmm.
I was also the guinea pig kid. I was the oldest one. So my parents were also kind of figuring out as they went how closely they needed to make sure they were meeting standards if we ever decided to go back to the traditional path. And I think they felt a little bit less pressure around that with my younger sister after they kind of
Hmm.
saw with my experience how all of this all actually works and also how easy it is to catch up to what they're doing in school if you ever
Yeah.
actually do decide to go back. Um, but I think there's a pretty broad spectrum for how you can teach your kids at home. And I think it really comes down to what the kid wants. If the kid has no interest in academics and they want to go do something else entirely, then why would you care about the college standards? It was kind of
Yeah.
tailored around where we thought I was going at the time, which evolved as I went through high school.
Makes sense. I'm curious about your parents. Like, how? So, two questions. Like, how influential were your parents? Like, kind of, did they somehow like nudge you in certain directions, or you should focus on this, and like, what's their background? Are like work wise, and
Yeah,
I'm
my
curious.
parents are amazing. And I am very close with both of them, and I thank them on like a monthly basis for homeschooling me. I'm so grateful. Probably partly because I'm working in education now, so I'm like all these things that I'm doing are all thanks to you. Thank you. But they so my parents um both went to college. They were both good students, both went to college, and both designed their own majors in college and did like a very hybrid, hacked together study plan independently. They didn't meet each other till like 10 years after this, but
Mm-hmm.
they had a pretty self directed approach to their own education. They're both very chronically curious people. We own a ridiculous amount of books growing up, and our favorite hobby was going to all the used book sales in the county. Actually, two counties. So I definitely was heavily influenced by just their way of life. They'd
Mm-hmm.
always be reading books and be learning about things and I'll call my dad on a Sunday and I'll be like, "Hey, what are you up to today?" He's like, "Oh, studying. Like I'm learning about this thing today." Um
Yeah.
so I
Awesome.
definitely got a lot of that by just osmosis from being around them. But
Yeah.
they were my when I was born, my parents ran a construction company. And then right around when we started homeschooling, so I would have been 6, my dad transitioned to working from home, which I did not realize as a child how incredibly abnormal it is to have your dad work from home and your mom be a stay-at-home mom so she can homeschool the kids and all of you are basically all home together 24/7
Yeah.
as a family unit. I think it's less weird
Yeah.
now because remote work is more common, but 20
For
years ago
sure.
that was not really a thing.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I first started to grasp that normal families only saw each other at dinner time, and I thought that was so incredibly strange. So strange because we were just together all the time and we lived on this dirt road out in the country, couldn't really see the neighbors. It was just us all the time hanging out, having our
Yeah.
adventures. And so my parents were very present. Both of them were really present and really involved, which is one of the things that really excites
Interesting.
me about remote work too, because that enables
Yeah.
more families to have that, which I'm really grateful for. I love my family. I think they're really cool. But yeah, my parents definitely had a background of and many years of pursuing their interests and learning independently before they had kids. So I
Mm-hmm.
think my sister and I both just sort of that was the way it was. So we both picked that up from them too.
Yeah. Would you consider your family they just like traditional like normal family, or were you guys like outliers compared to like your friends' family, or like everything was pretty much status quo with like your family, your parents?
I
Or
mean,
was there something different?
I think I think that we were very different from probably most of the people around us, and I had a very
Okay.
vague concept of that growing up because our prime like we would hang out with enough other homeschoolers that I sort of had this baseline. If I have other homeschooled friends and they stay at home all day too, so this is just sort of normal, right? And I think even among the homeschoolers we
Yeah.
probably were kind of weird, but I didn't grasp that. But I feel like in high school, I kind of got that we were like, let me back that up. I always conceptually understood that we were different, but I never
Yeah.
grasped it. Like, I never,
Right.
I knew that we were different. I could say that, but I didn't fully understand what it meant until honestly, probably even after high school. Like, I got it in high school too,
Hmm.
but it wasn't until I started interacting with
Yeah.
adults in the adult world as an adult that I started to grasp that my background was so different from them that I just had this really different, I don't know, baseline for how the world works and how I process information. And I feel like even still, I don't quite grasp it. I'm like, yeah, I'm not that different. And then I'll talk to people and I'll be like, wait a second, why does everybody think that this background is so weird? Maybe it is like, it doesn't feel that exciting to me. But
Yeah. Yeah.
again, conceptually, I grasp that it is
Yeah.
different.
Okay. I got you. So looking back, like, what would you say was the most valuable part of being homeschooled? like in a nutshell? Like what's one thing that really stands out?
That is an incredibly difficult question to answer
I'm sure. Yeah.
because it's not just one thing. Um, and it's
Because
very
like the
hard to
reason I
share.
ask it is like I'm sort of asking it to myself. Like if I ask myself that, like what's the most valuable part of like my like schooling through childhood, and like
Yeah.
I mean it's like nothing really comes to mind. If I had to say something right now, probably like the friendships, the playing outside recesses, like the things outside of school.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
This is a very loosely held answer. I might change my mind on this in like a week when I think about it hard
Yeah.
because I haven't thought about this in a while. But I think there's two things that come to mind immediately. And one is I never lost my love of learning, which a lot of people do. A lot of people lose their sense of curiosity and their innate passion for
Yeah.
learning stuff because it just gets
Yeah.
smothered by all of the coercion and all of the have to do's. And you start to associate learning at all with this very unpleasant, resistance filled, coercive process where your teacher says, all right, it's 9:15, so we're all going to sit down and do a math worksheet. And you're just like, I don't understand this and I hate this. But I have to do it. I can't get out of it. And that becomes what you associate with school and learning, and all of
Yeah.
the interest slowly dies. You just want to get out of it as much as possible. And
Yeah.
I didn't really have that experience. I did with a couple things, and math was one of them because my parents did take a pretty schooly approach to math early on, where it's like, you just got to sit down and do the work because you're just like you understand it, you're just being lazy, you need to practice it, basically was the implication. And I'm totally convinced that the reason I dislike math as an adult is because of that experience, and that if I had not had to do math until I became naturally curious about it because there was
Yeah.
some end that I wanted to accomplish that required math, that I would love math. But
Yeah.
I just have this negative association about math because it's just, kill and drill worksheets, and that's
Yeah.
not fun. So I think for a lot of kids, they just lose their curiosity altogether because it's just constrained in these tiny little boxes and these tiny little channels instead of allowed to be this vast, expansive thing that it's supposed to be. And I never lost that. And it's, as an adult, I pick up books on weird topics all the time where I just go, this sounds interesting. I want to know more about this. I'm traveling to a new place. I go read a whole bunch on the internet about the history of the place. I want to know about the economy and what industries the place was built on and what the natural flora and fauna is. And I'm just and what the weather is like and what the
Yeah.
demographics are like. I'm just so curious about things. And I know like a lot of people are, but I also know that a lot of people have that smothered in school. And so that was really
Mm-hmm.
important for me. And then I also learned to be very self-directed, and that I know for certain is a big differentiator between myself and most people who go through public school, like the average person who
Yeah.
goes through public school. Because again, in high school, well, actually, let me back up. In elementary school, most of my day was mine. So I could be incredibly self-directed, and I could go build projects, and I could go rig up weird contraptions using blocks and yarn and like scarves, and like make weird forts and
Yeah.
contraptions in the living room, and like whatever I wanted to do, go build forts in the woods. And so I was always a very internally driven person because I just have an idea and I'd go do that thing. And then in middle school and high school, I pretty much was given the reins for everything. And so I'd get up in the morning and I'd say, all right, today I want to go read a couple chapters of Sophocles, and then I want to go and listen to this oceanography lecture, and then I'm going to um, do some chemistry problems, and then I'm going to write an essay, and then like that's my day today. And it was all my doing. Nobody was standing there saying you need to do this stuff.
And all these things you were doing, like you were genuinely interested, like you
Yeah.
wanted to learn
Oh
about
yeah, I was
chemistry and
very
things.
enamored by the idea of a classical education. very,
Hmm.
very enamored by it and wanted it and legitimately enjoyed the process of it. So,
But what about like the side of like how do, like you don't know what you don't know. So like if someone like pushed you to do something, you're like, no, this doesn't sound good. I don't want to do it. But like if you did, you'd maybe love it. Like what about you know how do you like solve for that, or is that important?
I don't know if you have to. I think that my mom always called herself our facilitator, not our teacher. And she started telling me that when I was probably like second or third grade. And I loved that. She'd always correct me when I'd say, my mom's my teacher. She's like, well, I'm not really your teacher. I'm your facilitator. And
Yeah.
I just adored that, even as a kid and especially as an adult. And I think, obviously there's so much nuance and context in individual people's experience with this, but as a general rule, I think it really kind of depends on the kid and the parent involved, like what the best approach is. But I think it's really like you do have to trust a child's innate inner compass, and you have to teach them how to trust it. You have to
Hmm.
reinforce that they can trust it, because that's far more important than any specific subject that they might miss out on. Because
Right.
I really do think that when properly nurtured, and a lot of people curiosities are not well balanced and nurtured because again they've just been stifled by years and years of coercion. But
Yeah.
when your curiosity is properly nurtured, it does serve as a true compass, because the things that you're drawn to, even if you're not going to do anything with them immediately, you're probably going to be drawn to them again later. And they're probably
Hmm.
going to relate and connect in some way with other things that you're drawn to. So if you just keep chasing the things that you're curious about, you'll start to notice patterns and overlaps that make clear where you should be spending more of your energy and more of your time,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what's a useful place for you to be spending
Makes
energy,
sense.
and what types of things you might want to do in a more professional or traditional capacity. And so I think there's a lot of room for facilitators to put things in front of kids and encourage them and suggest, like, hey, what if we try this? Like, I don't think that it's always the parent's job to just get out of the way. I think it's more complex than that. And again, it really depends on the specific temperament of the kid and the stated goals of all parties involved. But I do think there's a lot to be said for exposing kids to things, but not necessarily forcing them to do the things,
Yeah.
like maybe sell them on the value of the thing, but let them chase the things that they're naturally curious about too, because they might not care at all about math in elementary school like I did. But by the time they get to high school and they want to understand physics and chemistry, and they realize that math is a prerequisite to that, and they don't have any negative associations to math because it was not
Right.
something that they associate with, like being bored out of their minds, hating life, sitting down to do some worksheet because somebody said they had to, they'll probably eat up all the math that they need to understand physics and
True.
chemistry, because it's something that they experience a joy in doing, because again they're curious about it and there's a purpose to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you said this word a couple of times, coercion, which is an interesting word, and it's kind of true. Like if you really think about the school system now, it's like the only institution like I could think of that since its existence, like however many hundreds of years, like it has not changed or evolved. Like the concept of like one teacher standing in front of handful of kids teaching the same thing in the exact same way to all these kids, like it anyone with any sort of logic can see that that's doesn't seem right. Every kid's so unique and different, and um yeah, I don't know. So in a way, when you say coercion, it's like in a way you are coercing these kids,
Yeah.
to grow up in a certain way, and it's interesting.
Yeah, the whole system is built on coercion, because there's no
Yeah.
way that you could get a whole classroom of kids to all do the same thing in a structured manner if you weren't exerting force. and
For
you
sure.
weren't struck setting up punishments that they for them to fear if they don't do the thing that you want them to do. And the whole idea of one size fits all education is so fundamentally flawed. It's such a broken idea, and it makes me laugh when people talk about school reform, because to solve all of the educational woes that we have
Yeah.
in America, because it's like, wait a second, it's not it's not that we just like make some tweaks to the system and then it's going to be fine. The entire system is flawed. Like the assumptions that it's based upon
Yeah.
are inaccurate. Like we have to go way farther back. We have to go all the way back to first
Yeah.
principles of what
It's
education is
way
supposed to be.
beyond a reform. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's way beyond throwing tax dollars to
Yes.
it. So what would you say it's so let's talk about that. Like what's wrong with the current public school system?
I mean, it
Let's
probably
dive
would be
into that.
faster to talk about what's right about it because it's not much. There's so much that's wrong about it. And for anybody who's actually interested in this, I would highly, highly, highly recommend reading John Taylor Gatto's book, Dumbing Us Down. Gatto was a public school teacher in New York City schools for 30 years, and he worked in everything from the wealthiest neighborhoods to the poorest neighborhoods in New York. And he was an award-winning school teacher. He won New York City Teacher of the Year in I think 90 or 91. And he that same year he resigned from his position with an op-ed in the New York Times talking about why the education system in America is so flawed. And he has a bunch of books that are really phenomenal, but Dumbing Us Down is the most accessible entry point in my opinion. And he walks through basically this idea that there's a whole bunch of implicit lessons that school is teaching kids by nature of the way it's structured that have nothing to do with the academic lessons, that are sort of conditioning them for how to engage not only with school but also with life, that are actually really
Mhm.
detrimental to kids. And I think that's a book
Yeah.
that if a parent has a kid in public school or they're thinking about sending their kid to public school, they should absolutely read it, because at least then you're going in with your eyes open. Even if you still decide that that's the best
Yeah.
path for you, at least you know what's going on. And I think that's really important. um
Yeah.
but I think there's so much that's fundamentally flawed about the way that we do education. um our education system is, I don't know how much you know about this already, but it was designed basically in simplest form to produce factory workers. Like it's designed like a factory, and it's designed to mass produce in the same way that a factory mass produces, like all the individual units that you need to fill all the individual boxes that make up society. So there's like all these categories of types of things that you need for society to function, and all of these units that fill each of these categories need to be fairly consistent and fairly similar, and they all have to understand how to follow rules the same way for the system to function properly. And so school is a factory that's mass producing factory workers, and then that's shifted to corporate workers and like all of these kind of like
Mhm.
pillar industries in our economy, all of the different pieces that you need for each of these
That's
pillars to
interesting. Yeah.
function. And it really has no bearing whatsoever on the individual. And it also really honestly even does a poor job at what it's designed to do, because for a lot of these career paths that it's setting kids up to go down, um, the academic outcomes are rather abysmal, and kids aren't even necessarily well prepared to go down a lot of these pathways. So even in its intended purpose, it's very flawed. But it's
That's an interesting point, and to even like go beyond that, how the concept of schooling, it's producing like quote unquote factory workers, like corporate workers, and but the educators, the teachers themselves, like they're all funneling through the exact same system in universities, and by and large, they probably share like the same ideologies, and in that sense, and like they're all essentially teaching the same type of values to the kids as well, right?
yeah.
So it's like, yeah, it goes even beyond that. But Um, yeah. So there's are there? Would you say? Do you notice any like call them maybe bad habits that kids that go through the school system that continue to have in adulthood that they picked up because of the school system?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
there's a lot of them. Um, Deferring to authority is a big one. Like everything
Mm,
about the way school is structured is predicated on you must defer to authority. The authority is always right. And
that's a good one.
that's
Yeah.
actually really detrimental in a lot of different scenarios that you encounter throughout your life, especially if you want to be an innovator of some kind. And a lot of people who are innovators are also people who did poorly in school, either because they
Yes.
realized early on that it's kind of ridiculous that you have to defer to authority, or because just like by nature they're not good at that. Um, but like it's not an accident that there's a correlation. There are people who get really,
That's
really
true.
good at doing super well in school. They're really good at hearing instructions and doing exactly what those instructions ask them to do in the
That's
way that they
true.
know that the authority is
Yeah.
going to appreciate.
Thinking on it, like I went to university and typical system, and
Yeah.
like just anecdotally now, just like thinking of like the really good students, the straight A students, they're all really good, like just corporate like employees,
Yep.
which is not a bad thing, but that's sort of, again, anecdotally, that's what I sort of see in my network. Would you agree? Does
Yeah.
that sound similar with you, I guess?
Yeah. I'm paraphrasing this. I'm not getting this quote or saying right, and I can't remember who to attribute it to either. But basically, the idea is that um, like it's mostly C level students that go on to actually start companies and do great things because they're used to both not being super successful all the time, so they have a higher
Yeah.
tolerance for failure, but um they also have a like they're just not afraid of breaking rules. And I don't know
Yeah.
the actual validity of that statement from a statistics standpoint, but I think it's a really interesting concept to think about, the correlation there. I think people become really deferential in school, and like I mean think about it, you spend 12, 13 plus years being told that the teacher's always right, and if you break the rules you're going to get sent to the principal's office, and you're a bad kid or a slacker if you're questioning
Mhm.
the authority too much. And like anybody who has any ounce of people pleasing in them is going to get those tendencies beaten out of them, and that's actually what you need. Those are the tendencies that you need to have in order to have new ideas and be willing to test them in the real world, and have strongly held convictions. And you're not necessarily always
Yeah.
right, but those are the things that drive innovation and progress, um, that give you the gumption that you need to go be an entrepreneur, or start your own thing, develop your own ideas. So that's a big one.
Yeah.
um
I'd love to see stats on that as well. Actually, now I'm then thinking further. I think for like I'm thinking of it, I'm an outlier myself. Like I went to university and all that, graduated, but I'm an entrepreneur and I've always been a business owner. But thinking again in my network, uh, most people that I know, if not all of them, other than maybe one or two that I can think of, that are business owners and entrepreneurs, like either didn't finish high school, like maybe dropped out of college or university, like were never really good students. Um, so yeah, I'd love. I'm sure there's stats out there somewhere. I'd be very curious
yeah, and we hear a
to
lot
see
of the
them.
stories about the billionaire dropouts like Peter Thiel and Bill Gates.
Oh
And it's
yeah,
kind of
there's
funny because
a
they're
whole
actually
bunch.
framed as an argument against dropping out of school sometimes, where people are like, yeah, I know Bill Gates did it, but you're not going to be Bill Gates, so you need to keep going to school.
Yeah,
And which is such a funny argument.
terrible messaging. Yeah,
But it's also, we know about the outliers because they're famous, but there's also like there's a real underrepresentation of in the conversation about the
yeah,
the average people who leave school and what they go on to do.
yeah. I can see one of the arguments like against alternative schooling or just arguments for traditional school system. One of them being like the social element. What are your thoughts on that?
um, I have a maybe controversial take on this because that actually
Oh,
was
let's
really
hear
real for me growing
it.
up,
Okay.
partly because I was just very committed to my interests and my convictions, and a lot of the homeschoolers I knew were much more mainstream in terms of their interests. They weren't in public school, but they were still following a lot of the fads and the trends that were, spreading through public school. And that was kind of tough for me because I would have a harder time making friends because I just found those things boring. And
Yeah.
so I had a lot of friends in elementary school from our homeschool groups, but then in middle school there was some schisms in our homeschool group. There was some drama between the
Yeah.
parents, and the group kind of split up, and that's a really awkward time for that to happen in middle school because then your friend group kind of gets
Hmm.
schismed. um and so middle school was tough. I had a handful of friends, but no like super, super close friends. And I'm a fairly extroverted person, so that was a little bit tough for me. And I did extracurricular activities, like I sang in choirs and stuff. So I had social interactions. I just didn't have like any
Yeah.
besties that I was hanging out with all the time. And then in high school, I had three really close friends, and my best friend lived in England, and my other two really close friends, one of them lived like an hour away, and one of them was like, I saw her, she said we sang in choir together, so I saw her there, but we weren't always in the same groups. So it was just kind of like, it was always an effort to, if you're when you're one of your best friends lives more than an hour away, like you guys kind of have to meet in the middle. And when you guys don't have your driver's
Yeah.
licenses yet, that means that like somebody has to
Yeah.
bring you and coordinate. And so we'd hang out
For
and we'd
sure.
do stuff together, but it wasn't like I had friends that I was around every day. And that was
And
a
did you
little
meet
bit.
these friends like in your in like homeschooling friends like online, or
Yeah, my
were these
friend
like
in England I met um online, and we were pen pals for a while, and
mm,
then like ended up doing we do Skype New Year's Eve calls every year, where because she
cool?
moved back to the States. She was living in England, but then she moved back to the US,
Yeah.
and I was in Eastern time and she was in Central time, and so we do New Year's Eve calls where we'd hang out on Skype and eat snacks and party, and then
No.
ring in the new
Yeah.
year twice, once for me, once for her. It was such a good time.
Cool.
um but so we spent a lot of time Skyping and emailing and stuff. And then the friend who lived like an hour away, we met through homeschool groups. And then my other friend I met through choir. And then I had a bunch of friends that weren't quite as close, but that I'd chat with a bunch, who I met through choir and homeschool groups and stuff. So I had a social life. I just had this dream of what I thought public school was like. And I thought it was going to be this place where there were just all these great people that I would be besties with, that I could hang out with all the time. And I actually dually enrolled my freshman year of high school. I took one class for one semester at my high school because I wanted to know what it was like. And I
Mm,
wanted to make sure that I was making the right decision by staying home. And it was
interesting.
so boring, and the
Yeah.
people bored me so much. I was just I did not belong in public school, and it
Wow.
was it was a real never again kind of
You
thing.
did the whole semester?
Yeah, I did a whole semester. It was a one semester elective. It was a journalism class because at the time I thought I wanted to be a
Okay.
journalist, and which I wasn't that far off. I'm a writer now, but
Yeah.
the class itself was super boring. And it was supposed to be some of the guidance counselor told me there were going to be a whole bunch of really smart kids in the class, and I was going to love it. And I just found all of the conversations so boring, and I didn't hit it off with anybody, and I just
Yeah.
really didn't belong there. But so for
Yeah.
me, it actually was kind of tough at certain seasons where it would have been fun to have a more vibrant social group in high school, and to be more like go hang out with my friends on Friday night and stuff. Um, which didn't really happen until Like I started working between my junior and senior year and then started making friends that way. But I'm also not convinced that that was a bad thing because I still was interacting with a broad array of people. I had friends to talk to, even if I wasn't hanging out with them in person. We were still, having all the teenage conversations about boys and about career
Yeah.
trajectories and what we wanted to be when we grew up and the projects we were working on and all of those things. Um, so I still got like that side of my development, I guess, and that side of the teenage experience. And I was interacting with adults all the time. And so I was still developing all of the social skills that people are so worried that homeschoolers aren't going to get. But I learned a lot of lessons about being comfortable being by myself too. And a lot of lessons about being more committed to the things that I'm interested in than I am to just doing whatever I need to do to fit in and make friends, which is really important. And I think that if I'd actually been in the public school system, first grade through 12th grade, I probably wouldn't have developed that because I was a real people pleaser in elementary school. So I probably would have done whatever I needed to do to make friends. And I probably wouldn't be nearly as interesting as I am now because I probably would have been just like very very
Yeah.
like the mean because
Yeah.
that's what I would have needed to do to have a bunch of friends. So I think it actually was a really, really important experience for me and my development to have these seasons where I was more alone. And that's
Yeah.
a really controversial thing to say because people are so worried about your kid being socialized normally. It's such a fear for people, but I really think that it's not even necessarily a bad thing for your kid to have seasons where they don't have a ton of friends around. Um, Speaking entirely from my personal experience, I think it actually was a really good thing for me.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really good perspective. I mean, so a question for you then relating to this. So I personally believe, and I think anyone would agree, like, socialization and social skills in general are just very important to, like, any successful job or
Yeah.
business. In the most cases, it's all about relationships and being able to nurture and keep and, grow relationships. Um, what are some ways parents or kids going through homeschooling can still like properly instill that? Because I think it's different, in my opinion at least. I think relationships are different, like online to like physical relationships. There's certain elements that are not the same. I don't know, I feel like having like a connection like in person, it's a little different than online for whatever reason. So what are some things you can do if you're going through the homeschooling path to build that type of social relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think one of the things that people get hung up on when they think about socializing their homeschooled kids, that's a really unhelpful thing to get hung up on, is they're really worried about kids hanging out with people their own age. And
Mm.
it's such a weird paradigm because it
It
has
is. I've
no
thought of that too,
evolutionary
actually.
bearing whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's a very modern concept that kids are going to hang out only with people their own age until they're like 22 and they graduate from college.
And I see it with my kids already. Like, my oldest, let's say he's 4 years old, and he has so much more fun and gets along with kids that are like a little older than him. For example, he doesn't like have as much fun or have the same type of fun with kids his age, right?
Yeah, it's
It's
actually
it's
more
interesting.
natural for kids to want to learn from older kids and be around older
Yeah,
kids or want
it
to
seems like it.
nurture and teach kids who are younger than them. We were designed to exist in a village or exist in a tribe where we like that's how our social proclivities have evolved, is to fit that type of environment where we're interacting with a broad array of people and we're raised by the whole village. And that's really lacking actually in our modern
True. Yeah.
our modern childhood, where if you're part of a large family or you're part of a church or some other organization of people that has a broader array of ages, you'll interact with a broader spectrum there, but you're still spending, the average American kid is still spending most of their day in school in an
Hmm.
environment where you're exclusively hanging out with people who were born in the same calendar year as you, which is such a weird and arbitrary distinction too. Like we just drew a line in the sand. It's like anybody who happens to be over here, you're in group A. Anybody who happens to be over here, you're in group B. Even though this person and this person right on the line are actually standing right next to each other, you don't get to be friends anymore. You're part of different groups now. And then the adult is this authority figure where you have to be like a little bit afraid of them because they can get you in trouble. And it's such a weird set of assumptions about how the world works to be teaching kids, because that's not reflective in any way, shape, or form of how they're going to engage with the world for the rest of their lives. You're not getting divided out by birth year at work. That's not how job groupings happen. It's like, all right, well, you were born in 1994, so you're in customer service. And you were born in 1997, so you're going over here and working with these people. Like, it's not how it works. So it's such a ridiculous
It
idea.
it
Go ahead.
really is, like, it is weird when you think about it.
It's
Like, it
really
truly is. A
weird.
lot of these things, yeah, it is, and it's tough to for a lot of people. I can see, even for myself, like listening to this, like since birth, like you're just grown up. This is the school system is all you know. So this is how everyone or most people are wired in today's society. That's what they know. So when you start having conversations like this, it takes a bit of rewiring in your head almost to really think about it. And like this is an example of like the age thing. It's weird. Like it's pretty weird
Isn't that
if you think
weird
about it.
how much rewiring it requires to start looking at the
Yeah.
world outside of this box? Think about how many other assumptions the vast
Hmm.
majority of us are carrying around about how the world works and what normal is and what you're supposed to do as part of your growing up process, because you just went through the school system and weren't exposed to anything else. Like there's so many assumptions that we have that we've never even looked at, because we have to take a really Descartes
Yeah,
approach to this, where we
for
strip away
sure.
everything and we're like, what do we actually know for certain about
Hmm.
kids and about what is required to take those kids to adulthood? And then we have to slowly build back up from there, because
Yeah.
again,
Even with the
it's
whole
not,
age
it
thing,
doesn't need reform. The whole thing is flawed.
it is. Yeah. Yeah. This age thing is funny. Like, come adulthood, when you get past a certain age, it's like I guarantee even you, like all your friends are like varying of different ages. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't matter when you're past like 20 or whatever. We're
Yeah,
like
I'm
we're
I'm
pretty much all
25.
level.
Most of my friends actually are either like 35 to 40, or they're like 20
Yeah,
to
there you go.
23. I have very few friends who are actually in their mid
Yeah,
20s. Like, man, it's just
that's a
coincidental. It's just the
strange one.
people that I've met along the way that I think are really cool that I want to be friends with. Um but it's funny because I was that way even as a kid too, where I'd have friends in a pretty broad spectrum, and I had grown-up friends. I had a pen pal who was a friend of my grandma's. She was this retired woman who loved to garden, who got really excited about a project I was telling her about at one point, and we started writing each other letters. And she was a really close friend of mine growing up, and she was like in her 70s. And
Yeah.
it was just like, it felt so normal to me that I was friends with the ladies at the post office, and I was friends with the librarians, and I was,
Hmm.
I'd go out and engage in the real world with my mom and my dad, but primarily my mom, because my dad was working during the day, so my mom would be the one going out running errands and I'd go with her. And that's how I learned social skills, was just by going
Yeah.
out in the world and doing. And I think it's actually incredibly easy to quote unquote socialize your kid if they're not in public school. You just take them out into the world and you let them engage with the world in the same way that you do.
Yeah.
And they're going to learn everything that they need to actually be um, like a competent, effective adult, and be able to navigate the social world. And the idea that, well, they're not going to learn how to interact with kids their own age, that part's easy. Like, that part's easy to gain later if you need it. Plus, they will. meet kids their own age. There's like a million different things that you can do to help your kid meet other kids, after school activities, sports, extracurriculars, homeschool groups,
Yeah.
library programs, theater classes. There's so much that you can do to expose your kid to other kids. But it's like most kids actually come out of school with horrible social skills. You'll see this all the time, where there'll be public school middle schoolers who go to an event where they go to a party or something with their parents' friends, and they're the only kids
Yeah.
there, and they'll just sit on the couch buried in their phones because they feel so awkward talking to adults. And then you'll see a
Yeah,
homeschool
that's
kid in the
true.
same setting, and they'll be really excitedly talking to everybody about the things that they're
Yeah.
working on, because they're it doesn't feel weird to them to talk to adults, whereas it feels weird to public
Yeah.
schoolers to talk to adults
Hmm.
and kids older than them and kids younger than them, which is so strange.
It is. That's a strange one. It seems like a lot of your homeschooling, because you mentioned a few like programs and stuff, was just on the computer, right?
Yeah.
Do you see any negatives to like learning in front of a computer every day
Um yeah, there's a few.
versus like person to person? Yeah.
There's a few. And this goes both ways, right? Because I also have a list of a few things that I actually think are more detrimental about learning in person versus learning on the computer.
Right.
Um, I do think that being in front of a screen is not really ideal. It's hard on your eyes. It's hard on your body to sit all day. It's sort of, you kind of get this tunnel vision staring at the computer, which is true for adults too, but I think it's just a little bit rougher on kids. And I think there's like being on electronic devices definitely alters your focus and the way that your brain works. Like, I remember feeling a shift when I was about 14 and I started spending a lot more time on screens, and it kind of scared me. Like, I used to have a really long attention span for reading, and
Hmm.
then that started to decline when I was in high school and I would spend more time on the computer. My attention span started to shrink, and I had to be deliberate about making sure that I was reading for longer periods of time and maintaining that
Yeah.
muscle. And so I think there are things about being on a computer that just change the the way your brain works a little bit, and that's something to definitely be aware of. Um and the way that you interact with people is definitely different. You can absolutely make friends in online classes, and there are a lot of really cool online programs that are being built that I'm actually really excited about watching. Things like Synthesis and Sora Schools, the Socratic Experience. There's a lot of really cool, innovative online schools for elementary through high schoolers, and kids make really close friends going through those schools. And
Yeah.
I think that's probably going to be a really big
Yeah.
part of our
I want to
education
talk
future.
about Yeah, I want to talk about like recommendations and stuff, but back to this point, which I'm just
Yeah.
thinking now to myself about the computer part of it, and I agree with you in the sense that it it does something to your brain and like how you interact and think and work,
Yeah.
and I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. So if you're going to the homeschooling path, like how do you balance that?
Um
What are some tips or
that is
things?
the $1,000,000 question, actually, because it's a
Okay.
lot easier in theory than it is in practice, especially if like all your kids' friends
Mhm.
have lots of access to their electronic devices, and then you're trying to limit it. It's just,
Yeah.
or you're trying to give your kid agency, but then you also want to establish rules. It's tough. Um, I can only speak from experience from the kids' perspective on this one. I wasn't allowed to have a like a handheld device until I was 14,
Hmm.
and I feel like allowed is maybe a little bit of a strong term, because if I'd been like, no, I'm going to get it, I'm going to go like find a way to make money and I'm going to earn everything that I need to go buy one, I feel like maybe the answer would have been different. Which I
Yeah.
actually kind of like as a line for kids. Like, if they're willing to go the extra mile to figure out how to make this thing happen, generally speaking, I think that's in very broad terms, I'm pro rewarding that kind of behavior. Although,
Yeah.
again, like always nuance, always complexity. But generally
Yeah.
speaking, I think that that's a good thing for kids to develop that overrides maybe some of the things that are negatives of them having whatever it is that they're trying to purchase. But
Yeah.
it wasn't until I was 14 that my parents were like, okay, like this can be on your Christmas list and this is like a realistic thing to be asking for.
Yeah.
Um, and for me, it was just I had got an iPod Touch at that point. I didn't have like an actual phone, but it served all the same functions. And that's when I really noticed my reading capacity, my reading muscles start to atrophy. But
Hmm.
besides that, I had a laptop that I used for school, but it wasn't really like a free for all. Like I didn't have a Netflix account or anything. I wasn't spending tons of time on YouTube. I was using it pretty much primarily for school. And part of that was me too, because I was kind of get tired of staring at the screen after school was done. But it was also like sort of it was my dad's laptop originally, and it was like the school laptop. Um, but then for my own projects, like I didn't have email on that computer or anything. If I wanted to be like emailing my best friend in England and then who then moved to Kansas, or if I wanted to be writing a novel, which was one of my favorite things to do when I was in high school, like all of that stuff was on my mom's computer. So I had to, and she used the computer too. So I had to be like, hey, mom, can I use the computer? And then eventually she'd need the computer. She'd be like, okay, you have like 15 minutes, then you need to get off the computer. So it was just this
Yeah.
very structured, but my access was limited. So I
Right.
couldn't completely succumb to the, completely succumb to the sort of addictiveness. I'm looking for a better word than this and it's not coming, but basically the addictiveness of
Yeah.
that technology can present. um and obviously like once I was on a handheld device that changed quite a bit, but I think the access being limited was helpful for me. And I think it definitely worked. And I don't necessarily have like I'm not a parent yet, so I don't necessarily even feel qualified to give very sweeping opinions on how to handle technology regulation now, because the world is very different than it was even when I was in
Yeah.
high
That's a
school
tough one.
10 years ago. And so I think it's a tough question to answer, but those are the initial things that I would add to the mix. I don't know if that even how well that even answers your question, but those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah. No, fair enough for sure. Um, Switching
Yeah.
gears slightly here. I'm curious if you know, happen to know, but do you know of any like data that compares outcomes of people that went through alternative schooling compared to traditional school? Like, for example, level of like social skill, monetary success, like intellect. Like, is there anything like that?
So that's a great question, and that's something I've been thinking about quite a bit too, because that is something I would like to compile. I think it's a hard data set to find, or at least it appears to be. I've been digging for it for a while, and I don't have like a comprehensive data set yet. Sidebar: if anybody's listening to this and does have stuff, please send it my way. That would be awesome. You can find me on Twitter at Hannah Frankman. I do accept DMs.
Yeah, that'd be a good
But I think there's a lot of anecdotal data about like colleges who love applications from homeschoolers because
one.
they tend to perform better in college, especially the first couple of years. They just transition so much better because they're more self-directed, and they also tend to be a little more responsible about education as opposed to kids who've been in school.
That's interesting now that I'm thinking about it. So in first year
Yeah.
university, like I was a good student in high school, got good grades. I sort of cruised through it. But first year university, I actually struggled because I took the same like high school approach of like, I don't have to study. Like I'll read the night before a test
Yeah.
and like don't keep up with the work. So like it really like hit me hard. So I had to learn a lot of that like self direction, the discipline, the all those elements that I can see a lot of homeschoolers already have that or built that. So
Yeah,
that's
it's
a good
funny
point.
because
I can totally
people
see that.
worry about their homeschoolers getting into college, and different colleges have different admissions guidelines, and also whether or not you even should go to college is an entirely separate conversation. But
Yeah.
um, a lot of colleges love homeschoolers for exactly what you just described. Like, homeschoolers are not always, but often coming into college already having these skills that you just described, struggling with in your first year. That's definitely a
Yeah.
known thing. And so there's a lot of um, like data that you can start to piece together about that for
Yeah.
sure.
The college one, I've said this since like the moment like my first born the son was born, and I still think this today. It might change, but I don't think any of my kids will be going to college or university personally. I can't see it.
Yeah.
Anyways, but we'll see.
Well, it's less and
I
less
wanted to put that
relevant.
out there to see if it's it's still true 20 years from now.
Yeah, I think
We'll
it's, I
see.
find it really funny. Maybe funny is too flippant a word. I find it fascinating and kind of weird when people are talking about, like, they're about to have kids or they have very young kids and they're talking about contributing to 529 funds. And it's so weird to me because it feels like such a gamble, because
Hmm.
the world is going to be so different in 18 years when your kid's ready to go
Exactly.
to school. And the assumption that college is going to be relevant feels very precarious to me. And granted, I'm coming from a very weird perspective, very abnormal perspective, where I was educated entirely outside of the system and I did not go to college. And I worked for a college alternative program for like 6 years. So
Yeah.
I have a lot of kind of a biased data set around how the world works and what is possible and what is relevant. But also, I find it very hard to imagine that college degrees are really going to be all that relevant in 18 years, because when you think about what college is supposed to do, it's supposed to it's designed to be a central nucleus for information. That was the original purpose of a university, was to be a place where you could have this hub of academia and learning and books and information, because at the time people were living in a very information scarce world, so you needed these central hubs. And that's no longer
Hmm.
true. Like, all of MIT's courses are online for free. You have wide open access to
Yeah.
information. You can Google anything and you go down enough rabbit holes and you find enough people to contact, and eventually the internet can get you to pretty much any piece of information that you require. So
Yeah.
college as a physical hub for information, entirely obsolete. College also serves the purpose of job training, and it does a very poor job at that. Most people have to go learn a bunch of stuff after they get out of college to be able to actually effectively do their job. It's losing its importance or its monopoly as a credential, because more and more companies are waiving their degree requirement, and more people are realizing that there are other ways to build a portfolio and build your credibility without going the traditional
Yeah.
paper credentialing route. And the cost is insane, and it's expanding really quickly. The amount that the rate at which college costs have inflated is ridiculous when you look at it, and the payoff just isn't there. So I
I
think,
totally agree. Everything you said. I overall, in a nutshell, I think the value benefit is like diminishing over time
yeah,
at a pretty significant rate. That's how I see it.
yeah, and it's
So, but I
even,
can only imagine by the time my kids are
yeah,
there,
I
what it's going to be.
I agree. And even from the standpoint of like building a network, which is one of the things that people come back to, like, well, you need the college experience, you need to make college friends. The internet kind of replaces that too. It's a lot easier to find
Yeah.
the relevant people that you need to build a network in your career of choice. So I actually think college has been dead for like 20 years. I think that
Yeah. I have to agree with you.
when computers became a standard fixture in the average home, like most people were online, college became obsolete. And honestly, I think became obsolete. Like, its death warrant was signed the minute the first computer came online. But it's not like it died for sure. when
Yeah.
like it's in hospice care now. It's just in denial about it, and we're all in denial too. Nobody's accepted yet
Yeah.
that it's going, but
Yeah.
I think it's
I don't
going.
think you're wrong. I don't think you're wrong. And coming from someone with literally a university degree hanging right there. So whatever.
Where did you go to
Um,
school?
in Ryerson University in Toronto.
Okay.
Yeah. And you?
I didn't.
Oh, you didn't?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I didn't at all.
There you go.
I not
Okay.
a day of college. Almost could say not
Nice.
a day of normal school too, but then I dually enrolled
Yeah.
in high school, so I waived my right to say
Yeah.
that, but it was totally worth it.
Hopefully, like 10 years from now, what you've gone through is normal, right? So like the thought will be reversed.
I hope so.
You know
That's
what I mean?
I certainly hope it's more prevalent at the very least. Like I'm not here to argue that my experience was perfect or that everybody should do what I did by any means, but I think the the base ideas that governed the direction that my education has taken are pretty universal. I think my parents got a few things
Yeah.
really right, giving me the self direction and letting me chase my curiosities and giving me the space to take ownership progressively as I went through my basically the process of growing up and considering themselves to be facilitators instead of teachers. I think, and letting me take a very goals driven, goals oriented approach to education. I think those things are very fundamentally beneficial to most people, and they can take you in a lot of different directions. Education can look very different for various people, and I think
Yeah.
that's really awesome. But I would love to see a lot more people get to have an education experience that's governed by those things, because
Yeah.
that is a really beneficial experience and
Definitely.
far more beneficial than public school could ever
Yeah.
be.
For sure. So I know we are cutting it short, but I do have some questions. So I want to
Yeah.
talk to just parents right now who are just have these questions and are, maybe like in my case, kids are starting school soon. So there definitely seems to be, at least in my area, more alternative schooling options coming up. It seems to be, just more out there now compared to ever before. What are some of the things parents should be considering when exploring these alternative options?
I think there's a couple things. Um, One, take everything that you think you know about education and throw it out the window and assume none of it's relevant. And then slowly piece back together what you actually believe actually matters about an education. Because really easy to just sort of grandfather in a bunch of assumptions that aren't relevant. So, like, be really deliberate about questioning everything that you think you know about how education is supposed to work, because there's a lot of assumptions that most of us are carrying around that are not necessarily accurate
Yeah.
anymore. Um, but I would think about your kid and their proclivities and their interests and their goals. Goals more if they're like an older kid. When you have a kindergartner, it's kind of hard to think about your kids' life goals as the driving force of their education. But you can think about, like, are they more social? Are they more like, do they prefer to work on things alone? Do they seem to really thrive when we go out into the world and we take them places where they can interact with their peers? Or they tend to really thrive like being at home, working in a really self-directed manner on their own
Yeah.
things? um, what are the areas that I think they'd really thrive if they were pushed a little bit and encouraged? Um, when I was when I was in this Montessori inspired private preschool and kindergarten, um, we didn't know yet that we were going to homeschool. And my my kindergarten year, we went and toured a bunch of different schools that we were considering. We went to the local public school, and we went to a few different local private schools, and we went to some hybrid schools that were like a combination of in person and homeschooling. We went to a couple Waldorf schools, and we just visited them all, and we got a sense of what each one offered. And I was there for all of these visits, and I got to get a feel for them too. And obviously I wasn't the one making the decision because I was 6, but I definitely felt like I was a part of the whole process. And I felt like my parents were very open to any thoughts that I had about them too. And I think that's really cool too. Like, let your kid be part of the process of going to check out a bunch of different schools and go visit a bunch of things. And that can, go visit is a relative term if you're looking at all online stuff, but go to online school open houses and see if you can sit in on a class and like really explore the different options. And I also would say I wouldn't necessarily feel too much pressure about getting it right because there are so many options. I really think it's okay to try various things and see which one's the best fit. And also, your kids' interests might change as they go through their elementary school years and their middle school years, and they might want to be in an in-person, very projects-based environment like Montessori or an Acton Academy when they're in elementary school. And then they might get a little older and say, actually, I'm really interested now in like problem solving and like more cerebral type stuff. And also, I don't really like the kids at my school anymore. I kind of want, like, I'm not enjoying working in person with other people. I want to go try synthesis or Sora School,
Yeah.
something online. And you can adjust where they're getting their education based on their needs. And you can also do your own hybrid approach where maybe they're in a forest school a couple days a week and they're doing something online. And you're kind of cobbling together multiple options to create the custom fit for your kid. I think it doesn't have to be as
Yeah. You don't
rigid
have to get it right
as people might
right away.
think. And there's also a lot
Yeah.
more options out there than people realize. And there are a bunch of people working, myself included, to build better databases and jumping off points for finding this stuff, which is really exciting because that's one of the big
So
hurdles, I think.
yes, rebelEducator,
Yeah.
right? Um, so that's obviously talk about that. What is that like? From my just
Yeah.
talk about that for a sec.
Yeah. rebelEducator is a new project we launched in May. Um, and I have a team working with me on this, which is super exciting. Um, we're building what we hope to be a big hub for alternative education and resources on alternative education. We want to build databases of resources, everything from like different online apps to different schools that people can use as a jumping off point to educate, like figure out what the best mode is for educating their kids. We want to build a library of case studies about like what it's actually like to do a day in the life at Aprenda Micro School and what it's like to do a day in the life at a Sora online school, and case studies of like projects that kids have actually worked on and seen success doing, like what's actually possible for kids to do when they're in their school years. We want to build a database of kind of the underlying philosophy around alternative education and the different modes of educating your kid that have nothing to do with, again, a lot of the false assumptions of the traditional school system. Um, and right now, like we want to be, when somebody says my kid's really struggling in school, they're not happy, we want their friends to say, oh, you got to go read rebelEducator. Like that's the place to start. That's the
Yeah.
need that we want to fill. That's the purpose we want to serve. So right now we're really active on Twitter. You can find us there. You can find a bunch of our posts at rebelEducator.co. We're on Substack. We have a weekly newsletter that you can sign up for if you want to get resources delivered to your inbox every week. There's a few different channels of content that we're building. And again, the goal is to just answer all of these questions that parents have that right now it's really hard to find answers to because a lot of information is really siloed and it's not
Yeah.
necessarily obvious where to go to find it, and it's not necessarily easily accessible. We want to solve that problem so that parents
I
can.
think it's so needed right now. I
Yeah.
think what you're doing is amazing. I think it solves such a huge void out there for even someone like myself who like you don't know where to start when you're thinking of something that is like so kind of taboo in society still and kind of not normal. So yeah, I love what you're doing. I'll put that all in the notes as well. rebelEducator.co. Question I have again. So is it possible for parents to work full time and homeschool their kids at the same time, or do generally sacrifices have to be made on the work family front?
Totally depends on the situation. Um, totally depends on the preferences of the parent. There are a number of online school options. So if you want your kids at home and you don't want to give up working and you're able to work remotely and be at home, you can that's a great avenue. Um, and I think remote work has I think there are two silver linings of COVID in on the education front. One is that remote work became a lot more prevalent, and that frees up so many possibilities for homeschooling. Because if you can work remotely and you can be home with your kids, even if you're doing other things, you can still be facilitating a great education for them with the right resources and the right, obviously, like temperaments of the kids and stuff. Um, and it also brought school home for a couple years, and it sort of normalized this idea of having our kids at home. And I think both of those things have really accelerated a lot of the shifts in education that we're going to see. But to actually answer your question, um, yes, it's totally possible to work full time and homeschool your kids, especially again if you have a remote job and you're able to be home with them. But I
Yeah.
knew growing up, um, parents who got really creative about different ways that they were keeping their kids at home and working. There would be moms who would team up with each other and they'd sort of alternate hours. So one mom would have both
Mm.
moms' kids, and then the other mom, while the first mom was working, and then they switch, and the other mom would go work.
Yeah.
And so you can do things like that. Um, if you have like the parents have, there's two parents involved and they have alternate work schedules, you can make it work like that. You can have grandparents involved where the
Yeah.
kids go hang out with the grandparents some days.
I think at the end of the day, if this is a route you want to go
Yeah.
down and you believe strongly enough for your kid, like you're gonna figure something out,
Yeah.
right?
If you want it badly
I
enough, you
mean,
absolutely will. And there's also so
yeah,
many options besides homeschooling that still aren't traditional school. Like micro schools are, there's a really great company. They're only US based right now and they're only in a handful of states because of the way that they work legally. But they're working on expanding hopefully pretty quickly. It's called Prenda. And
what's
they
it called?
facilitate the building of micro schools. So basically, like, usually it's a parent who will start a micro school and they'll have their kids in it and then a bunch of kids from like the neighborhood or their friends' kids or whatever. And it'll be like about 10 kids per micro school and it's mixed grade levels. And the way Prenda works, they're actually working with the
Or
state.
what was the name? You're saying Prendo?
Prenda, Prenda.
Okay, Prendo. Okay,
Prenda
gotcha.
micro schools. Um, they're they work with states to get the same type of funding that charter schools get, like by student, so
Mm.
that they're actually able to pay the parent who's teaching the micro schools, like it becomes a job for the parent. And then like all of these, they have curriculum and stuff that they're providing for these kids to work through. Um, and that's one model of micro schools, but there's a lot of other different ways that people set up micro schools. So like you can look for a local micro school or you can start one. Like
Yeah.
maybe you leave your current job but you start a business teaching kids instead. Like there's a lot
Hmm.
of different
Yeah.
avenues that you can take if you want to get your kids out of the
Awesome.
system.
Yeah. No, I love it. Um, so what's your like final message for those parents that, for the parents that don't want to or have questions or don't want to put their kids in the traditional school system or questioning it, but don't have the time or resources to look at alternatives? What's your message to those parents first of all, and where can they go to tap into more information? And you already mentioned a bunch of good, like the book you recommended, obviously rebelEducator.co. But what's your message to those parents who are strongly considering but just don't know how to break through the taboo?
Yeah. um a couple things. It's definitely, there are a lot more resources out there for this than people realize. A lot more resources, and it's a lot more accessible than most people think. um Everything that you need to educate your kids K through 12 is available for free online. Like Khan Academy alone will
Yeah.
cover all of your math requirements, all your science requirements. There's so much out there. It's a lot. People make it sound really terrifying to educate your kids at home, but it's a lot easier than most people think. And I hear that again and again from parents who have made the leap, that they're so surprised that it's actually been so much smoother than they thought it was going to be. Um,
Yeah.
and there are a lot of creative ways to design an education that fits both your child's needs and also your needs as the facilitator, um, and allows you to really tailor the way that your kid's education is structured around the needs of the whole family. Um, and there's a lot of parents who are really afraid of getting it wrong. And I think for most parents, that's coming from a really great place. And it's probably a really good thing that they care so much about that. But also, your chances of screwing it up are way lower than you think, because you can always adjust along the
Mm-hmm.
way. And your kids are learning these fundamental skills that they don't learn in school at all, like how to design their own education and how to own their own learning process that will serve them. Those are skills that they'll take through for the rest of their lives. And anything that you happen to miss in their education, they'll know how to pick up along the way. And I would consider your lack of expertise as a feature, not a bug, because your kids get to see you figuring this out, and they get to watch you learning how to teach them. And
Mm-hmm.
in that process, they are learning how to learn on a deeper and more meta level than just by them going and figuring something out for themselves. And what you're teaching them by not having all the answers, but figuring it out, is that it's okay to not know everything when you start. And that you're showing them again and again how to figure things out for themselves, and how to learn to the need, not just the test, and how to learn when there isn't a standard curriculum in front of them. And that is a more important skill and a more important lesson than anything they would learn in 12 years of traditional school. So it's okay to not have all the answers before you start. It's actually a good thing. And I would also say
Yeah.
that being homeschooled is hands down the best thing that ever happened to me. And I am eternally grateful. And my education came with lots of bugs and lots of flaws and lots of problems and lots of things that we look back on and we're like, wow, we definitely would not do that way if we were to do it again. And there were seasons where I hardly had any friends and I was incredibly lonely. And there were seasons where I would really not so great at doing my schoolwork, and my mom would threaten to send me to school. And I'd be like, no, don't send me to school. Fine, I'll go do it. And there were some really hard times. And it still was such an incredibly huge net positive. And I am so grateful for it. And
Love it.
there were lots of times when my parents weren't sure I was going to turn out okay at all. And I'm a very happy adult living a successful life, having a successful career, running a business. Like I'm doing okay. So your
Mm-hmm.
kids probably will too. And if you have questions, you can reach me at my personal Twitter account at Hannah Frankman. You can reach me. I run the rebelEducator Twitter account, so you can DM me there at rebelEducator. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. It's actually really helpful when I get questions, because it kind of gives me more context on what maybe some of the most important things are for me to be talking about to answer people's questions. So feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions that people have. I'm always happy to talk to parents who want to take the leap, and support however I can. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out to me too.
Love it. I love it. And Hannah, I'm so glad we were able to connect. This was a very insightful and encouraging conversation, I think. And I can't wait to share it with people, because, I think a lot of other parents and a lot of parents have questions right now. And I think it's such a relevant time. And the work you're doing is amazing. It's needed, and keep it up. You're doing incredibly important work right now. I strongly believe that, and so thank you for that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. This was a really fun conversation. You ask really great questions, and I'm really excited for
I hope
your
so.
kids too, that this is something that you're still so early in the parenting journey and you're thinking about all of this stuff, and this is all like top of mind for you. It
Yeah,
makes me really excited about the education experience that you're going to design for your kids too. They're very lucky to have you.
totally. Yeah, we'll definitely stay in touch. That's for sure. And again, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and we'll definitely do this again sometime.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and all the best. We'll talk soon.
Same to you.